Hello and welcome to The Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Samueli. With me today, of course, is co-founder of The Gaggle, Peter Lavelle. So, Peter, the Munich Security Conference has just concluded, and one person who was not in attendance was Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán. He wasn't there because he was delivering his State of the Nation address at the Hungarian Parliament. I don't know whether that was a coincidence, or I'm not even sure that. I doubt very much he would have attended, even if he wasn't delivering the State of the Nation address. But his address was kind of interesting. I mean, he said many of the things that he said before. He expressed skepticism about the NATO EU stance toward the war. But what is interesting is that he's kind of wrestling with himself about Hungarian foreign policy and the direction Hungary is going, because it's all very well being a critic of NATO and the EU, but if you're a member of that, there's a limit to how far you can take the criticism. So I just want to show you kind of a few highlights from his speech, which obviously, because it's a State of the Nation, it was quite long. But here, you can see it says, how do we overcome the threat of war? We would love to just end it, but we don't have the strength to do that. It's not our weight class. Therefore, if we want to protect Hungary, if we want a peaceful life for ourselves, we have only one choice left: to stay out of Russia-Ukrainian war. It's never been easy. It won't be easy because we are part of the Western world, members of NATO and the European Union, and everyone except us is on the side of war, or at least pretends to be. And then he goes on, here we are. Can Hungary remain on the side of peace in such circumstances, in direct opposition to our allies? Of course we can, since Hungary is an independent, free and sovereign state, and apart from God, we do not recognize anyone above us. But of course, this is really the problem, because Hungary is not a free, independent and sovereign state. I mean, if you're a member of NATO and the European Union, you ultimately have to follow the diktats of NATO and the European Union. I mean, it's it's understandable that he thinks that they're idiots and have pursued a disastrous policy. Nonetheless, he's part of this organization, and there's a limit to how far you can push it and still remain within these organizations.
Yeah, and they're fully paid up members of both clubs. Okay. Yeah. And at the end of the day, dissent is, let's just say, frowned upon. Okay. I mean, it's a miracle, in my opinion. You live there, actually, but that he's still leading his country. I mean, it must show his political skill and his popularity. Okay.
Yes, exactly. And the Biden administration, of course, is targeting him because, of course, the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, his father was Donald Blinken, who was U.S. ambassador to Hungary back in the day, in the 1990s, when it was assumed that Hungary would be an absolutely abject supplicant of the United States, that they can take it all for granted. Richard Holbrooke married his Hungarian wife, Katie Martin, in Budapest with Donald Blinken. I don't know, maybe he was the best man or whatever, but he was very much in attendance. So those were the happier days. And clearly, Blinken is not at all satisfied with Orbán.
And the Fidesz political party was very, very pro-West.
That's it. Yeah, exactly. Because it was assumed, because they're so anti-communist, they will automatically be very pro-West and will just do as they're told. Be easily translated, one to the other. And then, of course, so now they've sent as ambassador this. His name is Pressman, and was very openly gay. Lives with his husband, and they have a couple of adopted children. And as we said before, Hungary is it's quite a conservative country. That they're a little surprised, should we say, an ambassador with that lifestyle. But the Biden administration did this deliberately. And then the other day we had Samantha Power, who made a trip to Hungary.
Reared her ugly face again. There
exactly. In order to encourage, quote, independent media, unquote, and civil community partnerships engaged in civil society projects or whatever. No one knows exactly what this kind of gobbledygook means, other than that you're creating a new elite.
Yeah, that's right. And that means paid vacations in the United States, a semester in this college, in this university. All flights are paid for. I know people that did it from Russia, and they took it because it was free, and they knew from day one, this is a very anti-Russia operation. But they did, hey, it was free, so I'll take it.
Oh, well, yeah. Who's going to say no?
And they came back, and they just realized they don't need to. They don't need people like you and I to convince them what kind of operations it is. Okay,
right.
It's definitely, as George and I, one of the overriding themes of our podcast is about elite capture, and that's how you do it.
That's exactly it. And so she committed $20 million, which is quite a sum of money. Because again, when Hungary is a small country, and you only want to focus on a small group of people, and 20 million is going to go quite a long way. So anyway, but is it right? Is it morally okay for us to stay out of the war? I am convinced that it is right. Indeed, it is the only right thing. Russia attacked Ukraine, so we have to let Ukrainian refugees in. And we did well to support them with the largest humanitarian aid operation in our country's history. And then it says, this is the command of basic humanity, and we comply with it. And then it says that in the war in Ukraine, not are the armies of good and evil, but the troops of two Slavic countries are fighting a war limited in time and for the time being in space. This is their war, not ours. Hungary recognizes Ukraine's right to self-defense, to fight against external attack, but it would not be right from any point of view, even from the moral point of view, to put the interests of Ukraine before the interests of Hungary. But see, this is where it starts getting confusing, because he's saying, well, yeah, Russia attacked Ukraine, but then it's a conflict between two Slavic countries, and it has nothing to do with us, and yet it's right for us to give them assistance. Then you kind of are now dizzy. I mean, why? I mean, if it's a quarrel between these two countries, why are you in any way getting involved with humanitarian aid or whatever? Because if it is going to be humanitarian, then what about some humanitarian aid for Russia? I mean, if you're going to say, hey, it's just between these two Slavic countries, then provide humanitarian aid to both sides.
Well, I'm sure the people of the Donbass would be very happy.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the left in Hungary is also on the side of war. It would deliver weapons. You would assume the financial burden of the war and break off relations with Russia. We don't do that. We do not carry weapons. We also treat the money in the wrong way, because in the end, the money that belongs to us will be given to Ukraine by Brussels. For us, humanitarian support of Ukraine does not mean liquidation of our Russia relations, because that would be against our national interests, which we have the right to define for ourselves. That is why we do not agree to the introduction of gas, oil, or atomic industry sanctions, which will destroy Hungary. We know from the national consultation that there is national unity on this. That is why we maintain our economic relations with Russia, and we even advise the entire Western world to do so, because without relations, there will be neither ceasefire nor peace negotiations. Therefore, we do not agree that the priests put church leaders on sanctions list. Is just bad enough that this could happen to artists and athletes. And then it says, and it is also important not to narrow our vision, not to be provincial. Let's see beyond Brussels. Every country outside of Europe is aware of the limited importance of the war in Ukraine and the primacy of its own national interest. Let's not isolate ourselves from the sane part of the world. Sane part of the world. The Hungarian perception is only an exception in Europe. It is common in the world. The Hungarian government does not consider it viable to assume that Russia would threaten the security of Hungary or Europe. This is true for nuclear weapons at most, but the Ukrainian war does not reduce the risk of their deployment, but rather increases it. In terms of conventional warfare, the Ukrainian war showed that Russia would have no chance against NATO. We understood that the Ukrainians are trying to make Europe believe that the Russians will not stop at the Atlantic Ocean, but the Hungarians do not accept this threat. The whole world could see that the Russian military is not in a position and will not be in a long time to attack NATO. But okay, so he says all of this, and then you ask, so why in NATO? Why? I mean, everything you're saying here just shows that NATO doesn't do anything for Hungary's security. So I mean, it's like there is no, and there never was any threat from Russia, and that has nothing to do with Russia's military performance or anything like that. There never was any. I mean, and he says, I mean, this is a conflict, between Russia and Ukraine. It has nothing to do with anyone else. And yet, basically, Hungary and everyone else is paying the price for it.
Well, he's walking the thinnest of thin lines, isn't he, on this? Because he can't be emphatically one position or the other. He has to thread the needle in the most delicate way. Yeah, because he's under the boot too. I mean, Brussels, they're plotting his demise. Okay?
Yeah.
But at the same time, and I think, I don't know what it sounds like in Hungarian. Obviously, I learned Hungarian for 6 months. I was not successful.
No one is.
Okay, but it's extraordinary what he's saying here. I mean, the level of honesty is really, exceptional here, right. George.
Yeah.
I mean, here's a person that's going through pain in his soul.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's exactly right. And then he makes the point is that, to the rest of the world, they're not interested in this. Borrell kind of realizes it, but Borrell says, "Oh, that's because of the Russian disinformation operation. The Russians are very good at propaganda. That's why the rest of the world isn't interested." He said, "No, I mean they don't see what it's got to do with them. That's why let's not isolate ourselves from the sane part of the world." And then says, "The war also brought to the surface some instructive and serious truths. Don't pass them by without saying a word. Here is the first question to our NATO membership. Let's make it clear that NATO membership is vital for Hungary. We are too far east on the eastern edge of the Western world to give it up. Of course, it would be easier internally, following the example of Austria and Switzerland. We could play with the idea of neutrality, but history does not grant us this luxury." I don't understand why doesn't it?
Me too. I mean, look, he's won 4 landslides in a row.
Right.
Okay. Well, I think he has the political capital at least to seriously consider that option.
Right. Yeah. The NATO defense alliance, a military defense alliance that was formed to protect each other. That's why we joined, and that's why I felt historic satisfaction when, with 45 years of Soviet occupation behind us, I was able to sign the accession treaty. It is at least as important to understand what NATO is not. NATO is not a war alliance. NATO is not a war coalition. NATO membership does not entail any obligations beyond common defense. And the member states cannot expect each other to attack a third country together for some kind of common military goal. If some NATO members or group of them want to carry out an act of war beyond the territory of the member states, they must do so outside the framework of NATO. Those who want can go, those who don't want can't. This is a very awkward thing for Orbán, because in fact, Orbán was the Hungarian prime minister in 1999 during the bombing of Yugoslavia. Now, to be fair, he was still a young man then, and he may well have been naive and thought, "Hey, this is hey, I'm with the cool crowd." But that was, he was a part of what was an attack on a third power. But he's clearly suggesting here that you get involved in Ukraine, that has nothing to do with NATO, then you're basically saddling everybody else in NATO with a military commitment that has nothing whatever to do with them. There's nothing defensive about being involved in Ukraine.
Yep. And I think he's apologizing in between the lines here for signing up for them. Okay.
Right.
But his logic is impeccable. Okay. Impeccable. No wonder he wasn't invited to Munich. Okay? Nobody in Munich wants to hear this.
No, absolutely not. No. And
because you know, it's signing up was for mutual defense. It wasn't signing up to go to war. Okay.
Right.
That's something completely different.
And that's what NATO is. He's pretty much saying, yeah, that's what NATO is now doing. I mean, it's like the accession that he was engaged in. He thought, oh, this is going to be defensive, but of course, NATO is not defensive, and it was obviously not defensive in '99, and hasn't been defensive since. And Libya, he was already prime minister at the time of Libya. I mean, so, and then says, no matter how strong and powerful he may be, he who thinks he can control, manage, and phase war overestimates his own strength and underestimates the risky nature of war. Those who make these mistakes usually live far from the devastating reality of frontline combat.
We know who he's talking about, okay?
I think so too. But we live here, and the war is taking place on the land of a neighboring country. Brussels residents have not yet given their lives in this war, but Hungarians have already. While Hungarian symbols are being thrown down in Munkac, the Hungarian leaders are being replaced at the head of our schools. Again, he's talking about Ukraine. Many are dying a heroic death on the front line. The Transcarpathian Hungarian minority does not deserve this. More respect for the Hungarians in Munkac, Kiev, Brussels, and Washington. So again, he's pretty much saying here, that, the Ukrainians are really treating our people, like what? I mean, they're actually getting killed on the front lines, and you're destroying the Hungarian community in Ukraine. You're taking down Hungarian symbols, Hungarian flags, you're attacking Hungarian education. It says more respect for the Hungarians. Well, you're not going to get any. And again, this is your NATO and the EU that you're member of.
Yeah, well, you're a small nation, so join NATO and we'll protect you. But actually, the opposite happens. You're a small nation, and we can determine what your security interests are, and your minorities outside of your sovereign borders. Well, that's not our problem. Okay? It's not a NATO problem. It's not a NATO.
Not a NATO. No, tough luck, buddy. So Europe is on the brink of war. It balances on a thin board. In fact, they're already at indirect war with Russia. If you deliver weapons, if you provide the satellite information necessary for military operations, if you train the soldiers of one of the warring parties, if you finance the operation of the entire state apparatus, and you impose sanctions on the other party, then no matter what you say, you are at war. For the time being, an indirect war. I mean, for the time being. The danger of drifting in has become permanent. It started with helmets, continued with the delivery of devices not suitable for taking a human life. Now we are sending tanks, and fighter planes are already on the agenda. And soon will we hear about so-called peacekeeping troops. Peacekeeping. You can hear Stoltenberg, peacekeeping. That's it. Like sleepwalkers on the roof, we should also understand how the pro-wars were taken over by the moon sickness. I don't know what that means. And how did they get on the roof? We understand our Polish and Baltic friends, despite any differences of opinion. Their history explains a lot. And it goes, well, what, and so on. But you can see, I mean, again, his logic is impeccable. Yeah, you're at war. And don't give us this crap that we are not a party to this conflict. I mean, Orbán says this is nonsense. Of course, NATO is a party to the conflict. And that means as a member of NATO, Hungary and everybody else are a party to the conflict. You've been dragged into this war. And then it says, it shouldn't have happened this way, or rather it would have happened differently. We could have given a guarantee that Ukraine would not be admitted to NATO, but we did the opposite and confirmed our previous decision in 2008 that we would admit them. And then we could have followed the solution we chose in 2008 when the Russo-Georgian, i.e. Georgian War broke out and Russia occupied 20% of Georgia's territory. We then decided not to allow the fire to bite, and under the leadership of President Sarkozy, who was a brilliant negotiator, the conflict was localized and a ceasefire was reached. We could have done that. We could have done what we did in 2014 under Angela Merkel, when Russia invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea. We could have chosen war like the one we're having now, but then we, the West, decided differently. Negotiation instead of war, peace instead of war. Well, we kind of learned something about that. I mean, basically, Hollande and Merkel stepped in to save the Ukrainians from complete military disaster, only in order to build them up for the next round. But Orbán does this thing of creating these heroic figures on the past. They're no longer here, unfortunately. Merkel, oh, she was really great. I don't remember any good relations between him and Merkel when she was around. I mean, he told her basically, we're not taking any of these goddamn immigrants that you brought over from Syria. But
George, but you said it already earlier, is that being in NATO, being in the European Union, I mean, I suppose he's not hiding the fact that being in the club is okay. It's kind of cool, okay? But the dues are pretty high when when they're saying you got to up the ante. But we didn't sign up. We signed up for paying dues of this amount, to get this in return. You're changing the terms and conditions of membership now. You can't. You're doing it unilaterally.
That's exactly right. And of course, Hungary, it's obviously it's borders on Ukraine, and Hungary is a prime piece of real estate. So I mean, way over there in Brussels, Paris, Rome, they're not going to get involved in this. They're a long way away. Hungary's kind of there. I mean, so if this war escalates, Hungary is going to get sucked in. I mean, that's it. I mean, there's just nothing you can do about it. I mean, I think that's what he's saying, in his frustration is that, hey, you've got all these plans for war, and, we're going to be there in the front line. In fact, we already are. He's talking about these Hungarians in Ukraine who are getting killed. So, and that's obviously a feature of Hungarian history. I mean, they were kind of World War I. This was, cooked up by Germany and Austria against Serbia. Hungary had nothing to do with that, but Hungary was, boom, it was the big loser of World War I. World War II, I mean, Germany just marched into Yugoslavia and marched through Hungary in doing so. That made Hungary already a party to the war. So, I think it's a very sensitive point for any serious Hungarian leadership, is that, we basically just get sucked into other people's wars. And then he said, there was still pro-war people. There's also a strong German and French leadership that was brave and acted in time. That is how the war ended and the Minsk agreement was established. A year ago, the West decided differently. When Russia launched an attack, the West did not isolate the conflict, but raised it to a pan-European level. It could have been classified as a local regional war or a military conflict between two Slavic states, as Hungary proposed. What happened is yet another argument against the Brussels superstate and in favor of strong nation states. When the member states decided, there was peace. When the imperial center decided, then war. And then that is how the war ended. Minsk agreement was established. A year ago, the West decided differently, and then so on. And then it says, we have no illusions. We are not naive. We're not dreamy pacifists. We know that the negotiations will not take place between Ukraine and the Russians. There will be peace when the Americans and the Russians negotiate. It will inevitably happen, but the later, the higher price we will pay for it. According to the pro-war group, time is on the side of the Ukrainians and the West, so the fight must continue. It will change the balance of power. There will be victory over Russia, and victory will bring peace. But according to the Hungarian government, further fighting will not bring victory or peace, but the death of hundreds of thousands more. a widening conflict, countries embroiled in open war, years of war destruction, suffering, and the threat of world war. Let us Hungarians stay on the side of peace. I think, is that it? Yeah, that's it. So you can say, you know, that he's just arguing with himself.
Yep.
But, you know, basically, you know, Hungary made a fateful decision in the 90s, thinking this is going to be a cool club, no real obligations on us. And they're just finding, hey, even the Warsaw Pact was better than this. I mean, you know, the Warsaw Pact at least kept us out of wars, and we didn't actually have to do anything. I mean, you know, we had to follow, you know, Moscow's foreign policy, but we weren't going to get killed. Here, we're going to get killed.
Yeah, and again, you know, something I've said many, many times is that obviously you're going to have the Baltic states and Poland. One of their motivations to join NATO is anti-Russian sentiment, obviously, okay? But for Hungary, and maybe the young Orbán was thinking, hey, this is a club, you know, it's defensive, you know, you know, the Americans call the shots, we probably won't have to spend too much money on it, you know, we got other things we'd like to spend money on. And now the script has been flipped. It's that countries like I mean, even Croatia, they say we didn't join to do this. We joined not to go to war. That's what, okay? And again, the countries of Eastern Europe were hoodwinked. No, you're going to be the cannon fodder for Washington and Brussels, okay? Right. And it's dawning on them. And Hungary is so unbelievably dependent on Russian energy. I mean, they can't cut that off. I mean, basically, it'll be saying to the Hungarians, we're turning out the lights and they're not going to come on again for a long time.
Yes, yeah, no question. And that's already a very interesting point, because remember, during the 90s, when the United States pushed for this NATO expansion, they assured the Russians, hey, actually, your situation is better than before because we're going to control these countries. So whatever hostility they have, we're going to control it. You know, so, you know, if they were outside NATO, you're going to have more problems. You know, within NATO, they're going to be, you know, under our control. Just like, you know, when James Baker told Gorbachev, it's in your interest to have a united Germany in NATO. Do you really want a united Germany outside of NATO? Then you've really got problems. That's how they sold it. And of course, the exact opposite.
It's rubbish. George has made the case a few days ago, and it's a really very smart one to keep in mind. The Warsaw Pact actually extinguished all of those issues. Right. Okay. Yeah. The countries of Eastern Europe, they're not fighting over real estate anymore. Right. They stopped doing that. No, the Hungarians pissed off by the treaty after the First World War. Yep. Were they pissed off losing this chunk? Yeah. But they weren't going to go to war for it, George. That's different. They're not going to go to war over
it. Right. That's right. That's right. And that's the interesting thing, that Hungary has actually taken the position that in theory was was something that the Soviet Union might have expected, that once you end communism, once you end the Warsaw Pact, then there's no real hostility. Well, why be hostile? It's over. You know, there's no more Soviet domination of Hungary. They're not imposing a communist regime that everyone hated. What's the reason for the hostility? And that's the Orbán's point. There's no reason for hostility towards Russia. No reason to be friends, but there's no reason to be hostile. But there's
every reason to be pragmatic.
Exactly. And that's the rational position. But for everybody else, you know, like the Baltic states, Poland, obviously, but that goes even for the Czech Republic and you know, Slovakia and the rest of them. They're, you know, they're still just constantly stoking a hostility over what? It's hard to see, you know, what that is about. And it's yeah, go on.
It's like I'm an American. I'm still upset about the British burning the American White House in 1812. Why do we even have diplomatic relations with that country?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, pragmatism prevailed.
Right. Right. No, exactly.
And not that I, you know, take libertarian positions very often, but trade does kind of keep, resentment and hate under control. I mean, at least we get cheap energy. Okay.
Right. That's right. But look, I mean, look at the Czech Republic. You remember when, was it last year? I guess no, maybe 2021. Remember when they suddenly invented out of whole cloth a story about an explosion, some explosion that took place in a warehouse, and it's the Russians were behind this, and then they expelled a whole bunch of Russian diplomats. I mean, it was nothing. It was just nothing. Just the Czech wanted to, burnish their credentials. Hey, we hate the Russians even more than you do. It's like, just no. I mean, the explosion took place years ago, so they suddenly, whoa, our investigation have found, that this was what the Russians were behind this explosion. No, no one was even killed. I mean, it was just simply an explosion in some warehouse, and so we have to expel some Russian diplomats over that. There's no pragmatism. I mean, here's, let's look at George Soros. Now, George Soros, remember that tweet that he sent out about somehow, Ukraine's struggle reminds him of how Budapest was fighting for its survival when the Red Army was honing in on Budapest in 1945. For a Jew who was living there at the time to say that somehow this Budapest was heroically resisting, the Red Army closing in on Budapest. There's a lot of this kind of deep, very suspicious animus that somehow have kind of burst to the surface as a result of this war.
The Red Army lost 600,000 troops liberating Hungary from Nazi rule.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, George Soros. I guess you didn't get the memo. Okay.
Right. Yeah. but
George Orbán, it's really one of the most interesting. I mean, you and I have been doing this kind of year in perspective here. That is some of the most sane writing that we've come in a year's time.
Right.
I mean, really.
Right.
And here's a man that is very troubled. I mean, it's when you hear people, the Germans talking, the British talking, the American, these are big countries that have sway, or at least have,
right,
a modicum of sway. Hungary's a small place, and it's very vulnerable. And when there's a rumble, it's in the neighborhood. Okay.
Yeah. Exactly. It's in the neighborhood, and a country that has had really bad experiences. The 20th century was a really bad century for Hungary, and so when this war, Hungary's immediate instinct is, and with Orbán, is let's bring this to an end as quickly as possible, because if we don't, it's going to end badly, and it's going to end badly for Hungary. Every war in this part of the world always ends badly for Hungary, and that's
and
the
on top
point. Yeah.
And on top of it, we can end on this here, is that NATO and the values of the European Union, George. No matter what happens in Ukraine, I can tell you one of the biggest losers, the Hungarian minority, because if you have this virulent ultra-nationalist ideology prevailing in Kiev, it's bad news, to say the least, for Hungarians in Ukraine.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't see that equilibrium changing very much. Okay, because if they lose, it's going to be revenge, and they have a revenge, and they're going to be looking for saboteurs and backstabbers. Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if these rabidly nationalist types are going to be the dominant figures in this post-war Ukraine, I mean, it's going to be very, very bad for the Hungarians, because they're going to take it out on them. I mean, it's like they can't take it out on the Russians. They won't be in a physical position to take it out on Russia. They will be in a physical position to take it out on the Hungarians. So I can see a serious ethnic cleansing operation going on there.
I want to end on this. George, because George is a Hungarian extraction, as the British say. I always found that really curious, extraction. And he lives in Budapest here. It's really important to look at what Orbán has to say, because he's so demonized in the West. Everything that is written by liberals criticizing him. He's popular in his own country. He wins elections. I mean, why don't you give the guy a break, okay? Right. But last year, outside of the major players that, of course, everyone pays attention to, but then here you have this voice of unbelievable reason from a man that has a very torn soul about protecting his people and knowing history as well as he does. You should look more often to what he has to say, because I can guarantee you, and George and I have talked about this before, he speaks for a lot more people than in Hungary. I can guarantee you that.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right. I mean, he's really the kind of the lone voice, or at least, the lone figure who's giving voice to many, many people in Europe. I mean, there's no question. There's no enthusiasm for this war in France or Italy, in the UK. But people are so cowed by the political establishment that they don't really give voice to these feelings. But Orbán is just the exception, because he's actually a political leader who was willing to say this, willing to say out loud what the real situation is. So you're absolutely right. I think there's a lot of people, and there's really none of the polls suggest that there's any great support for waging this war on behalf of Ukraine. There's just none. I mean, the public is not on board with this war.
And because of the time differences, George and I will be looking very closely at the protests, the Rage Against the Machine.
In DC, yeah.
And if we get something interesting about it, we can count on George and I commenting on that tomorrow about this time. Okay, so everyone, I'm glad George brought this up. There is voices of reason out there, and they should be listened to and heeded. Okay, this is The Gaggle with Peter and George. We're on Locals, so please go to the gaggle.locals.com. I know, buddy, I'm almost finished. Please visit the store. And on Tuesday, George is back on track with his live
stream. On track. Live stream on Locals, 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Come with comments, suggestions, criticism. Everything is welcome. On the way out the door, think about little buddy, because he's raging against the machine. And it's like, this tip jar, the machine is just is taking the coins out. So in order to alleviate Buddy's rage, let's see if we can whip out some money, dunk it in his tip jar. That'll calm him down. We're very grateful for all of your help and friendship and support. The more you're able to donate, the more of these videos we can make, the more we can invest in new technology, and above all, we can keep Buddy calm, at least for the next few hours. So remember, if you like The Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.